Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Really pleased to be welcoming you for such an important day of conversation about what's happening with downtowns, what's happening to central business districts, how's that going to affect our daily lives, how we work, where we go, how we get there, all the things that are important to urban life, and why downtowns are so crucial to that conversation. So I'm very appreciative that we have so many people that have signed up for these sessions, and particularly that we've got colleagues like Richard and Craig and Richard Barkham as well, who will join when he's available, to get us started on this, why this conversation matters so much, I guess is what we're trying to get at. And so as people may realize, first of all, this is Zoom, obviously, welcome to Zoom. And we can see you on the chat. So by all means, correspond with people in the chat, send questions up there. Always great for you to check in and tell us where you're watching from. I know that we have presenters today from 7 time zones. I counted this morning. This is not just a conversation taking place in Canadian cities, it's happening globally. And you're going to hear from people throughout the day that are going to give you ideas and provocations and questions about how everyone is coming to terms with this, trying to anticipate what the future may hold, but also just looking clearly at what the reality is. And is this a moment? Is this an opportunity for us to reimagine and not just go back to what was, but to potentially imagine a different kind of future for downtowns and their role in cities. The CUI is a national organization. We're in the connective tissue business, as everyone knows, and but our headquarters is in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many First Nations, specifically the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis, and we're covered by 2 treaties, Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. We have continued to struggle at CUI with all of our colleagues in the urban city building about the extent to which urbanism has been excluding. It has systematically and structurally reinforced an inequality and a lack of equity in how our neighborhoods are planned and how what opportunities people have in their communities. And so we're very cognizant of this, that we have to come to terms with that legacy, but we also have to go forward in different kinds of ways and being much more inclusive and engaging and making urbanism accessible to everyone. So I say that recognizing that we have a panel this morning, which is affectionately called a manel. We have 3 men and they're all Caucasian. And so we start with the greatest respect of our colleagues to appreciate that, but to suggest that through the day, we have different kinds of voices and different perspectives. And we have lots of diversity participating in these sessions, which are recorded, as everyone knows. And so we hope that that collective experience will be as reflective as it can be of the diversity of urban life. And these 3 are 3 guys who have toiled in this vineyard for a long time and have, not that they're old, just saying, same age as me pretty much. And we have been in this discourse for some time. And so we're really, it's important to take stock, I think, and to get a sense of what are we really dealing with? What are the authentic struggles? What are the opportunities and what might that look like? So I'm delighted to have Craig Alexander back to City Talk. He's the chief economist and executive advisor at Deloitte. He's had a very full plate in the last year, Craig, so I feel for you. It's a time when lots of questions are being fielded by people like you, and you've been absolutely stoic and generous in trying to share your insights, and so we're really delighted to have you join us. And then after you, Richard Florida, a person well known to Canadian audiences and also to American audiences, who holds a number of different positions as a distinguished professor in a bunch of different places, and has been an advocate for urban life before many other people were. And now here he is to offer for us what he thinks the future of a CBD in a downtown is. And then after him will be Richard Barkham, who's the global chief economist for CBRE based in Boston, who's got all the data and has a lot of questions that he's going to ask. And I know all 3 of these folks are going to ask us serious questions about what the implications are. So if you haven't signed up for the subsequent sessions, just because of the mechanics of Zoom, just to be clear, this is a Zoom session, and then there's another Zoom session, and then there's another Zoom session. So if you want to stick with us for the day, and why not? Be with us for the day. You can register for those other 2 sessions if you haven't already, and Gina and Jamie will put it into the chat. You can see it. So let's start. Get us off with a bang here, Craig. So happy to have you with us. We appreciate the wisdom you're going to offer, and over to you.
Thanks very much. So Mary, can you just confirm you can see the slides? Great. So my objective in the next 15 minutes is give you a whirlwind economic overview and talk about the economic environment that we're operating in, the prospects going forward, but also talk about the challenges and opportunities specifically from a municipal point of view. The starting point has to be that we are in the midst of the biggest recession in modern history. The Canadian economy, based on the StatsCan data that was just released, the Canadian economy contracted by 5.4% in 2020. And if you compare the magnitude of this downturn to the financial crisis of 0809 and what we dubbed at the time the Great Recession that followed, this recession is many-fold worse. Now, when we think about the Canadian economy, it's typically we talk about it in terms of the Canadian economy or the provincial economies. But as we all know, over time, the Canadian economy has become increasingly more densified and more urban-centric. And so, an alternative way of actually discussing the performance of the Canadian economy is actually to talk about it from a city landscape, because for example, if you take the Golden Horseshoe in Southern Ontario, you're talking about that group of cities represents 25% of the total Canadian economy. And when we think about Vancouver, Calgary, Halifax, Montreal, Quebec City, I mean these are what actually the larger cities in Canada are what's actually driving the experience. The other thing is that larger cities have been hit harder by this downturn than smaller cities, and it's related to the health risks and the government lockdowns. And then we should also mention that not only how are we dealing with a pandemic, but we also had a very big commodity shock last year. So in terms of the outlook, the Canadian economy at the tail end of last year was still, it slowed, but it slowed to still a strong pace of expansion. I think the second wave and the renewed lockdowns that were imposed likely mean that the first quarter growth is going to come in, very soft. But as governments are relaxing those restrictions, you're going to see growth reemerge, and then this is exactly the experience we had earlier last year. And regionally, what we're going to see is all of the provinces swing from economic contraction to growth. However, for many of the economies, we're not going to get back to pre-COVID levels in 2020, in 2021, and in fact, for some like Alberta, we're probably not getting back to pre-COVID levels until sometime well into or towards the end of 2022. And that's that's assuming that we deal with the health risks. Now, we know that in the near term, the economic numbers are going to be weak because of the second wave, and there is risks and concerns about a third wave. But we should recognize there is a light at the end of the tunnel, right? We are going through the process of vaccination, and when that is completed, the health risks will have diminished and the economy will recover. I think from a point of view of municipalities, a lot of the performance is tied to the industrial composition of the urban economies, like exposure, how much exposure there is to certain industries. And the experience from an industry point of view has been very uneven during this downturn and very atypical compared to other business cycles. So if we think about the industries that have been hardest hit, right? What this shows you is the bottom of the bar is how much the industry contracted from peak to trough, and then where it was as of November in terms of recovery, and that would be the top of the bar. And what you can see is air transportation, accommodation, food services, arts, entertainment, recreation, tourism. These were all sectors that were really pummeled by the first lockdown, and they were very weak to recover. And of course, these are the sectors that are also being hit again during the second wave. You can see retail actually was really suffered, but then it came back strongly and actually got back to pre-COVID levels. But one of the disruptions here has been that the shift in the sales has shifted towards large businesses. And so when we look at the job market, what we can see is the bulk of the job losses have been lost in certain industries, but also within industries within small businesses. We've also had a lot of inequality in terms of who lost their job, because a lot of the employment in the most affected sectors have a lot of low-paid workers. What we have seen is the bulk of the job losses have been in low-paid workers, and when you ask the question, okay, so who from a population point of view, who are in that, who are those low paid workers? The answer is you have a very high representation of disadvantaged populations, women, visible minorities, immigrants, youth. There's segments of segments of our population, and those that face the greatest challenges are the ones that have been impacted greatest by the downturn. And this is shining a light on the issue around inequality. And when we think about the recovery, this is why having an inclusive recovery is so critical. Now, I am confident that as the health risks diminish, we are going to have a strong recovery. And part of the reason for that is really the consumer. The consumer is 55% of the total economy, and what we have seen during the recession, what we've seen is that Canadians have saved a vast amount of money. So what happened is, it's quite remarkable. We had a very sharp increase in unemployment. The unemployment rate went from just under 6% up to 13% before coming down, and yet personal income last year actually increased. And you sort of scratch your head and you say, how is that possible? And the answer is that the government transfers to households exceeded the total lost compensation. And because of that actually helped, that helped support households during this income shock and during this crisis. It helped maintain consumer confidence. And at the same time, we've had a lot of government transfers. Canadians haven't been able to go out and spend their money on things they like to spend money on, right? So they haven't been able to go to movies or eat out at restaurants or take their family on trips. And so to give you an idea of the amount of ammunition that is present that can drive the recovery on the household side, typically Canadian households save about $25 to $35 billion a year. And in the 4 years pre-COVID, they were only saving about $10 billion a year. In 2020, the accumulated savings that were just reported yesterday, accumulated savings in 2020 was $212 billion. If even a small fraction of that money comes back into the economy, it will drive a lot of economic growth. My concern is that the recovery could be unbalanced. It could be driven by consumer spending and residential activity that we're seeing, which Canadian residential real estate is on fire, and that's what we had after the financial crisis of 2008-09. What's lagging is business investment and exports. And really, if we want to have a healthy, balanced recovery, we're going to need to see more investment and more export-oriented growth. And this is going to be true for urban economies in terms of performance of the business sector. Now, the government transfers have come up with a massive price tag. The debt to GDP ratio for the federal government has gone from 32% to 51%. I would flag, though, in the 90s when we had our fiscal crisis, it was 72%, and the cost of borrowing for the federal government was around 9% on a 10-year bond, whereas today you're paying less than 2%. So even with the fiscal expansion we've had, it isn't putting us in a position of a fiscal crisis. When you add in the provinces, the picture deteriorates, and the comparison to other jurisdictions is not as favorable. Canada still looks better than many, but the massive amount of debt that's been taken on is going to be a fundamental challenge as we move forward. So and there's a good question, given the amount of financial relationships between urban centers and provincial governments and urban centers and the federal government or the provinces and the feds, the fiscal rebalancing that's going to have to come in the post-pandemic world is going to take years, if not a decade or more. And this is where I think it's really important when you think about the prospects for the municipal economies. You look at basically the way I think about the outlook is I think about structural trends that are transforming the economy. I think about trends that have been accelerated by the crisis, and I think about trends that we didn't have before that are with us now. So structural trends, addressing climate change and the impact of climate change has not been altered by the pandemic. In fact, in some cases, governments are sort of using it to accelerate their progress on this. Aging populations, the dependence on immigration for population growth has not been altered, right? And then we have economic challenges of weak investment, poor productivity, and we're likely to have a sustained low interest rate environment. When we look at trends that were with us pre-COVID, but have been accelerated by COVID. The top one is, as I already mentioned, we were worried about household debt pre-crisis, but now we have to worry about the debt that businesses have been taking on to keep afloat, and government debt. I think that we actually have a large number of zombie businesses in Canada, and that when government support programs are reduced, I think you are going to see insolvencies and bankruptcies for small and medium-sized businesses in Canada increase significantly. So I think, municipalities should be mindful that the small and medium-sized businesses have been under pressure, and although we didn't see insolvencies and bankruptcies balloon last year as they would normally in a recession, it's a function of the government support programs. Another big category is that we've had this massive shift to all things digital commerce, digital services, and the shift to remote work, right, which has been facilitated by digital. And we've also had an element of increased automation and adoption of big data and AI. And if we think about all those three things together, what are they? The answer is it's the IT revolution. So you could make a strong thesis that COVID, the pandemic, has actually accelerated digital disruption, and that actually has a lot of implications, right? So in terms of things like where are people going to live and work makes a big difference to municipalities. The increase in automation and the shift to digital is changing the demand for what skills workers have. And then you have emerging trends, which we didn't have pre-COVID that we now have, and that's things like disrupted supply chains. There's an element of some repatriation of global activity could take place. Governments are thinking about what essential products should be manufactured domestically, and we've seen a massive increase in the role of government. One of there has been a change in consumer behavior. I'm not sure that one is going to be persistent. I think that when the health risks have diminished, I think Canadian spending patterns will return to closer to normal. But most of these other effects, I actually think, are going to be with us for some time. And what it does is when I do my industry level forecasting and I take this landscape, I take this framework and I apply it against Canadian industries, what I get is a picture that says, if we just look at the bottom of this, if you just look at the x-axis for this chart, from going from left to right is the growth potential by industry. And what you can see is the industries that have the greatest post-pandemic growth potential are actually not the ones that have been the traditional leaders of economic growth. So I think we're going to get industrial, a big shakeup in the industry leaderboard in terms of economic growth. And this has a big impact on municipalities because of the different composition of industries within each major urban center. The other thing I wanted to stress was the fact that pre-pandemic, I don't think we were on the path to prosperity. Because of aging population, poor productivity, weak investment, the sustainable rate of growth in Canada had dropped from, when I started my career, we used to think healthy growth was around 2.8%. Pre-pandemic, we thought it was around 1.7. And so, we've almost lost half of our potential growth rate. And that's what actually, when you add on inflation or prices, that's actually what happens, in terms of income creation that provide tax revenues to all levels of government and gives us the capacity to meet, key commitments. And the reality is that, I kept arguing that we needed to change the path we were on, but it didn't resonate when we had a 30-year low unemployment rate. Now that we've had, now that we're in a pandemic, it is now resonating that we not only need to come back from this crisis and get back to, recover the jobs we lost, we actually need to come back and put ourselves on a much stronger path to prosperity. And cities have to be part of that. So when you think about this, it has been a tragic economic environment. It has been a perfect storm for cities. It has led to a combination of lost revenues for cities, but at the same time, an increase in demand for services. The crisis has also revealed, inadequacies that we had pre-COVID. Things like, we weren't dealing enough with inequality. We didn't have an income security framework that was designed for the modern labor force. Childcare is a critical piece of social infrastructure, but was underappreciated pre-pandemic. We clearly need to do a better job in how seniors age in Canada and the experiences they have. The residential housing boom has created a affordable housing challenge, and we are seeing weaknesses in our infrastructure, including digital infrastructure. So we really need to think about how do we come back from this stronger. And I would argue that from a municipal, from an urban point of view, I mean, there's three main things we need to do. First, we need to create inclusive, sustainable growth. And all three elements of that, all three words, inclusive, sustainable, and growth, are all critical to achieving that. It means that we're going to need regional strategies for recovery and development, because, as I said, the industry experience has been different. So the playbook, the recovery playbook, may be different by large urban center. As I said, the demand for skills has been altered. Plus, there's large unemployment, and we need to tackle affordable housing. And going into the inclusive side of things, we need to invest in the social determinants of health, right? If we improve social outcomes, we'll actually take burdens off the health system. Then there's the infrastructure as a catalyst for growth. And I think that from a city point, cities need to think about more digital, more green, expanding broadband, making the transit systems seamless. And if there is this perpetual shift to a remote work, we're going to need to make the transit systems more attractive, to basically pick up some of the slack. The other thing to stress here is, I'm not convinced, like, even with the shift to more remote work, understand that the Canadian population is going to grow. So ultimately, we are still going to need all that housing in urban core, and it could be that more immigrants come in and live in urban centers. But ultimately, I'm not worried that. I think it's going to be a short-term issue in terms of the impact both on commercial real estate and residential real estate. This idea, like, we've seen people moving out of cities during the pandemic and into the suburbs, and that's driving a lot of the house price growth. I don't think that's going to persist. And then as the population grows and the economy gets bigger, in the near term, we might have less demand for commercial real estate, like office space downtown. But as population rises and businesses grow, you're eventually going to need more real estate downtown. So it's a short-term disruption. And then we are going to need a more coordinated and more responsive government. And there's a lot of dimensions here. Like the fiscal challenges are going to be acute, right? So trying to find regional procurement models that will save money are important. Encouraging local digital solutions, right? The shift to digital is actually how we get to a stronger productivity, better outcome. Improving service delivery, regulatory reforms to help be a catalyst to business formation. As I said, we have a lot of zombie businesses, and we're going to lose a lot of businesses. So we're going to need to have policies in place that will accelerate business formation and startup. So this is a very big challenge for cities to undertake, but I would stress that there's a huge opportunity here. Pre-COVID, we were actually not on a path to prosperity, and we were basically sleepwalking into a world of stagnant growth and living standards. The crisis actually creates the catalyst for change, and if we embrace that, we can actually put Canada on a significantly stronger growth path. So I'm going to stop there. Sorry I went so fast, but there's a lot to cover.
Fast is good. And, it's just a minor little topic, the future of Canada's economy. So, you breezed through it very well, Craig. Thank you. Just to reinforce, everybody, presentations will be available at canurb.org. The recordings for the sessions will be available at canurb.org. When you guys are in the chat, can you just adjust your settings and share them with everybody? So Marcy Birchfield, you just shared a fabulous thing, but only with panelists. So can you if you have already posted, post again to panelists and attendees. We have several hundred on these sessions, and you all know a lot. And so you can have a whole conversation over there, a parallel universe in the chat, and answer each other's questions and put resources up there. So panelists and attendees. Craig, thank you so much. Lots of questions will come to you when we're done. Richard, over to you, Richard, Florida.
Well, thank you, Mary, so much. And I was able to prepare a little slide deck for everyone. Craig, that was fantastic. And I got a brainstorm this morning. I changed my title. I was talking about a post-pandemic downtown, but I think erring on the side of optimism, let's talk about building our downtowns back better, something Craig at the very, very end of his presentation alluded to. So look, I think Craig said this very nicely, and I wrote a book, I called it The Great Reset. Maybe we can think of this as a great urban reset or a great urban reshuffling, but it's not a fundamental disruption. Our cities will survive. Our downtowns have survived. Cities have survived much worse. I have conducted over the course of the past year now a pretty systematic study of pandemics, infectious disease, and plagues, and this has been terribly tragic for Canada, for my home country of the United States, especially in the world. But it's not nearly as serious as the plagues in the Middle Ages that struck Europe, killing 30, 40, or 50% of the population of some cities, the cholera epidemics, the Spanish flu, not nearly the kind of thing that happened to Berlin in my parents' lifetimes, occupied by the Nazis, mass bombardment, occupied by the Allies, partitioned, and it survived. It's one of still the great cities. Our cities are going to survive. Our downtowns are going to survive. They're going to be remade, accelerating trends already underway. And if we take some purpose and if we have some intentionality, we have an opportunity to build our communities, our downtowns, our workplaces back better. If we don't, there is no doubt in my mind, given what I just saw from Craig, that we will rebuild them, but they will become, if they were inequitable across the lines of class, gender, race, ethnicity, country of birth, before the pandemic, they will become ever more inequitable, less inclusive, less resilient after the pandemic. So this is where public policy and governance matters. If we want to build them back better, they will come back. But if we want to make them better, more resilient, safer, more inclusive, all of those things, we have to do it together. I like to look at this very simply because Mary knows this about me. I am a very simple-minded person. And my simple-mindedness is compounded by the fact that both Mary and I were very influenced by Jane Jacobs, who liked to write and speak in clear language. That's what I've tried to do, take my own simple-mindedness and compare that with very simple language. So I think the factors that are reshaping our places, our cities, our downtowns, our suburbs, and our rural communities across Canada, North America, and the world can be separated out into two simple buckets. There are pull factors that are pulling people out of urban centers, downtowns, and towards suburbs and rural areas. They want a backyard. They want a space to remote work. They want a space for remote education for the kids. They want to be able to get outside. They want to be near parks. And there are push factors. There are a set of factors that are also pushing, and those factors don't act equally on all industries, as Craig said, nor do they act equally on all demographic groups. So the pull factors, this is the one the media is obsessed with. And by the way, the Canadian and the American media are for some reason obsessed with the decline of great cities. If you look at the number of stories that have been written on the decline of New York, on San Francisco, and on Toronto, by the way, three places I believe that will be best positioned to come back strongly. It's the smaller cities across our country, the Windsors, the Detroits in the United States, the Pittsburghs, the Toledos, the Akrons. That'll be much more hard pressed, and some of those outlying suburbs, but that's nonetheless the pull factors. Families moving to suburbs accentuate, less so in Canada, much more so in the United States, so don't confuse the two trends. And in the United States, not due to COVID, but due to the fact that cities are inhospitable to families, mainly from a point of view, not just of crime, but there are not good educational options. It accelerates and compresses family formation moves. People tend to make a move when they have children and when they require more space. The example I always use is my own parents moved from Newark, New Jersey to an outlying suburb in New Jersey when I was 2 and my brother was about to be born. Not because they didn't like Newark, but because they needed more space in a backyard. A desire for public amenities. And I think we will see, and I think there is some fear of public transit. And a fear of public transit and transit, and I think that's likely to stay for a while, but there are also push factors. There are factors that are pushing certain groups back towards urban cores. One of the biggest groups to empty cities, if you look at the data, by the way, the data on San Francisco now suggests, this is hysterical, that 4,000 people left San Francisco permanently. 4,000, not 400,000, 4,000. One of the biggest groups to leave cities were young people. Young people are often in college and making a great city their temporary home. And big cities are great college towns, or they're there after college and mom and dad got on the phone and said, get the hell out of the city and get back with us where you can be safe. Cities are very attractive to young people. Mark Moose at the University of Waterloo calls it not gentrification, or a subset of gentrification he calls youthification. They have thick labor markets. They have abundant job opportunities. They have always been attractive to young people after pandemics, going back to the Middle Ages, after the Spanish flu. And now they're filled with consumption amenities, and they're where other young people are. You can make friends, you can go on dates, you can find a partner. In the United States, young people ages 25 to 34 accounted for over half of population increase in close-in urban areas. And if young people have flocked back to cities, they will do so. But the big change, I think, as Craig alluded to, that's going to impact downtowns is the shift to remote work. The best data we have is for the United States. Unfortunately, this is something I have bemoaned since being in Canada. I wish our data were better. Mary actually and her team helped me get some more Canadian data, which I'll reflect later in the slideshow. But before the pandemic, between 2 and 5% of workers were working full-time remotely, and about 15% were part-time remote. When the pandemic hit, nearly every professional worker was working remote, but that still meant about half of the workforce of essential workers were working in person. Now about a third to 40% of the workforce is still remote, like we all are today. After the pandemic, as best we can estimate based on pretty darn good surveys, and I should have a piece coming out in the Wall Street Journal this weekend or next on this. So I've looked at these surveys very closely and under the tutelage of a very fine editorial team. 20% to 25% of people we expect will work full-time remote. Another 20 to 30% will work part-time remote. That's a big chunk of people shifting from in-office work to remote work. The surveys say that actually workers would like to work more of the time from home. And I look at remote work as a perk that talented people, the so-called creative class, are going to have to be offered if you want to retain them. Companies are saying 20 to 25%. So people actually would like to work remotely more than companies are predicting. And by the way, I think Canada and Toronto has been a little bit less likely to accept this. I don't know why that is. I think American cities have been more likely to be accepting of these changes. I think we are a little bit resistant to them, and I don't know why that is. Look, the other change that's going to be is the change to retail. Craig talked about that. Retail has been devastated, commodity retail. I always say that before the pandemic in Toronto, I could get very little of what I needed online, certainly compared to my life in the United States. Once the pandemic struck by, say, May or June of last year, I could get everything I needed delivered to me in much greater diversity than any US city, with the possible exception of New York, within 2 hours. And not just packages from Amazon or Walmart. I mean, gourmet groceries, whatever I wanted, fish, meats, cheeses, whatever, could be to my house in 2 hours. So much so that I got to know all the delivery people personally and, congratulate them and thank them when they came to our door. So retail is going to have to be remade. That's not going to be bounced back. That's a big implication for downtowns because that's where lots of retail is. It's going to have to be remade as much more experiential, unique food, coffee, shopping experiences. And I think a big trend will be an emphasis on health and wellness and an arena for social interaction. But the changes to the office will be much, much bigger. The office as we know it will not come back. The place that you park your laptop, go to a cubicle, sit around and do your work. People who can avoid that will avoid that. I've long been a remote worker. The office will have to become an arena for social interaction and for context. And it will need to be a place, and we're seeing these stories. I've been talking to architects about how these offices in superstar districts like downtown Toronto, lower Manhattan and midtown Manhattan, downtown London, are going to be completely remade, filled with amenities, the likes of which we've not seen for these top-level superstar talent. The office will have to be a brand statement, a statement of who you are, like a brand store. It will have to be experiential. There'll be lots more emphasis on health and wellness, much more casualness. Offices will have to move some of their functions outside, like we've moved dining outside. Here's one for you. Large tech companies have been gobbling up office space in major superstar cities, especially in the United States. They've been the big thing that's gobbling up office space in New York as banks and insurance companies, so-called fire or don't. I've been struggling to understand why that is. These big tech companies, the name companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and others, have seen a 40% reduction in onboarding new people. These office spaces, however they're redefined, or the use of co-working spaces, are critical, not for us. We're remote workers. We're well established in our career. We know our colleagues. We know our collaborators. Office space is critical to onboarding new talent. The office will no longer be the office as a building. It will be a neighborhood. You'll look at a day at the office like going on a local business place trip. You'll go in and you'll have a meeting. You'll go out to a coffee shop or a restaurant. You may do a fitness activity, go for a walk, go for a bike ride. The retail surrounding the office will have to be much more actively curated and special, and third places will have to be reimagined in powerful ways. Calling upon a title, invoking a title from the late, great Jane herself. We're looking at the death and life of the Central Business District. The Central Business District, as we know it, is a relic of the industrial age. Office workers packed and stacked into vertical 9-to-5 skyscraper canyons. These were deadened and deadly districts, the kind of districts Holly White and Jane Jacobs railed about. We're looking at a forecasted 20% reduction in demand for office space, an estimated 5 or 10% reduction in spending in Central Business District economies. And I think we're going to have to shift and most remote works jobs are in urban centers, which is very interesting. So most people who do remote amenable jobs live in large metropolitan areas and in urban centers. So we're going to have to reimagine these business districts, not as business districts, but as social interaction districts, recreational districts. You'll help me come up with a better term. Live-work neighborhoods. We can actually add more housing and make them more balanced neighborhoods. Yes, they'll be primarily working neighborhoods, but at the margin, say 20 or 30% of that space can be reused for housing and residential housing. To shift from the central business district to the neighborhood business district, a big one for a place like Toronto and other large cities, but also other Canadian cities. An opportunity, if you're going to shift work and do less work in the central business district, to shift it out closer to where people live. So more remote workers are choosing to live, especially those with families, in suburbs and in rural areas. You see this boom in people looking at places like the Muskokas, Prince Edward County, blah, blah, blah. There'll be an increased demand for co-working in those spaces. I recall a meeting I had with WeWork before they went through all of their comeuppance. And in that meeting, I suggested that WeWork should begin to build co-working spaces in the suburbs. I was laughed out of the room. My friends who used to work with WeWork now call me or email me and say that was really a dumb idea that we had. In fact, there is an incredible need for co-working spaces and office facilities, hub and satellite facilities out in the suburbs. This is an enormous opportunity to repurpose old abandoned suburban office parks. We're actually working with office developers throughout the United States and North America to think about this, to turn abandoned malls. And this gives an advantage, of course, to pre-war walkable suburbs and a disadvantage to car. Look, they call this a 15-minute neighborhood. I like to call it a complete community where you can do everything you need within a short bike from home. Why are these good? They reduce long commutes, so particularly great for a big place like Toronto. They save energy, they improve the environment, they mitigate climate change, and allow us to have a more integrated life, balancing home and work. But I mentioned this, the real challenge is that the fortunate third of us who do knowledge work, who do professional work, who do high technology work in the finance and insurance sector, educational, medical sectors, we're going to be able to take advantage of all of that. We're buying more housing, we're resetting our lives, we're taking advantage of remote work, we're spending more time with our kids, we're getting off the treadmill. But that's only a small fraction of society. The COVID crisis has already reinforced pre-existing divides of economic, social, racial, and geographic inequality. Visible minorities have been 5 times more likely to get COVID, 4 times more likely to be hospitalized from COVID, and 2 times more likely to die. Black Canadians are 1.5 times plus more likely to be working in low-wage jobs, less than $16 an hour. People in the top fifth of the income distribution are 5 times more likely to be able to take advantage of remote work and avoid, of course, all of the dangers of infection that go along with being an essential worker. Are we looking at a playback of the 1920s? This follows on Craig's important remarks. Are we looking at the roaring 2020s? I think so. The Spanish flu was followed by the roaring 20s, vibrant economic economy, a stock market boom, a surge in arts and culture, the jazz age, flappers. New York City added 2 million people. Greenwich Village surged as an artistic and cultural center. Plus, we began the onset of suburbanization. But it was, until now, the the single most unequal decade. It was the decade of the Great Gatsby, of the rise of the robber barons, of tremendous inequity. It took until 2 decades after the pandemic, until the New Deal period of the 1930s and the post-war era of the 40s and 50s. Can we seize the opportunity, or will history repeat ourselves? Will we be satisfied with going back to a vibrant economy, but one which is far less equal and inclusive? Or will we take the opportunity to build back more inclusive and resilient places? That choice is ours. Thank you very much.
Richard, thanks very much. Okay, so again, as we often say in our City Talk sessions, you know, it's one big ongoing conversation, and we're going to be having it all day. So the fact that Craig and Richard have given us these perspectives and tried to sort of stir us up first thing. I just want to say that we have people coming in from 7 time zones, and I really appreciate the people on the West Coast who got up early. So hello, Victoria and Vancouver. Thank you for doing that, and the mountain time zones in between and central. I think we have every province but the territories here on the call. So, and then lots of people coming in from Asia and from Europe, and I see some from Africa as well. So terrific to have this. As I said, it's a global conversation, and to actually put it into context for us, we've got Richard Barkham, who is the global chief economist for CBRE based in Boston. And he's going to now give you his perspective, and then we'll have a bit of a chance to have the 3 of them in conversation with each other before we break at 45 minutes after the hour at 11:45 Eastern. And again, folks, just reassure you, slides will be posted at CanEurope. You'll find them. This recording will be posted there. And if you have particular questions that you want the 3 of them to tackle in the conversation that will commence when Richard's finished, just throw them into the chat. We'll try to get to them. Okay, Mr. Barkham, so nice to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, nice to see you too. So I think that downtown areas do have a problem. I don't think it is a existential or a fundamental problem, but I do think the balance of economic forces are moving against the downtown area. And I think that we're going to have to do something with policy, or it is just possible that some sort of cycle of disinvestment that we've seen before that could spiral out of control is going to hit home. So what I want to do is explain why I think that, and instead of throwing a bunch of kind of disparate real estate facts at you, I just wanted to put a little bit of a framework around it and give you perhaps something that I'm sure you're familiar with, you know, a potted history of cities in the Western world, which I see as kind of, you know, the downtown area really comes out of a battle between centrifugal forces, which are forces that kind of push economic activity to the outskirts, versus centripetal forces. And I do think that the centrifugal forces are on the increase. But let's just remember 1890, broadly speaking, to 1950, you had centripetal forces dominating. You had manufacturing sector that tended to cluster together. Wages were low, families needed access to cheap, high-density housing, and retail services clustered around those households and were specialized, providing, you know, urban services that I think, you know, actually were very economical for households. Transport costs were high, commuting was expensive, and, you know, we didn't particularly have vibrant downtown centers, but we had economically viable downtown centers, dominated as they were by manufacturing activity. But the period I want to kind of draw attention to is probably the period from 50 to 1990, where we see the centripetal forces taken over by centrifugal forces, and we see manufacturing, we see activity dispersed to the suburbs. You know, manufacturing tends to consolidate, doesn't need to cluster anymore, needs more land, so it moves first to the suburbs and then to emerging markets. Wages tend to rise, people want more space, families, you know, disperse to the suburbs to get kind of big houses. Retail follows. You have a wave of mall creation, kind of consolidating economic activity in the suburbs. And of course, transport costs fall. You only probably got one earner in the household. Commuting is less expensive. So you've got a city structure that is facilitates suburban and ex-urban location with people commuting to the downtown where they need to, although quite a lot of economic activity also in the suburbs. And that, I just, at the back of my mind with some of the things I'm seeing about real estate, I think that's all a bit of an apocalyptic vision, but some things that I'm seeing worry me and point towards the growth of centrifugal forces. But of course, in the period 1990 to 2020, we had a real urban renaissance, centripetal forces dominating, all about the growth of the service sector, firstly finance and domestic services, then international finance and hyperfinance, and more recently the tech sector. These are sectors that really needed to cluster together. Wages were rising, family size shrunk, so families needed less space, but they're kind of, more, cash rich, but time poor. And so we have this kind of flowering of food and beverage as well. And of course, transport costs rise with, and it's not really the direct cost of transport, it's the opportunity cost of people's time. So there's a real preference, I think, particularly of the professional, managerial, scientific, or technical occupation grades to really cluster downtown. And we've had this kind of urban renaissance that I've seen across the Western world. And this is what I think for better or worse, and I recognize the inequities that have grown within cities, the really high cost of housing that has arisen as well. Western world is chronically short of housing. But what I'm seeing from real estate, I begin to wonder whether we're moving into a situation where these centripetal forces are being replaced by centrifugal forces, particularly around, and other speakers have referred to this, just remote working, and just the remote working, allowing families for the first time to escape and find not just more space or a backyard, but actually affordability, begin to actually own a place. And of course, this is all about the digital economy. It's not really a pandemic thing. It's pandemic has accelerated the digital economy, but it is all about that. And of course, when I say transport costs fall, I don't mean they actually fall, but if people only need to go into the office twice a week or 3 times a week, then effectively commuting is less expensive. The tie to the downtown area is becoming slightly less strong. So, that's the framework. That's what I'm beginning to worry about. What do I see in real estate? Well, let's just come to the Zoom phenomenon. I'm not an advocate for this particular technology, but we know what we're talking about. It's remote working. Our surveys tell us that 84% of businesses plan to accelerate the digitalization of work, more digital tools, more video conferencing. How do we think about it? Well, this is something as the world's biggest real estate services company that we really have to grapple with and think about. We make a lot of money out of office leasing. And this is kind of what we've come up with. It's a little bit technical. It's not quite as bad, I think, as some of the surveys have suggested. What we think, based on detailed surveys of our clients, is that probably we'll see about a 32% drop in number of days in the office. But actually, that only equates to a 9% drop in the demand for office space. So what we've got here, just in this little schema here, is maybe in 2019 people spending on average 4.3 days per week in the office. We see that dropping to 3.25. That's a kind of 32% drop in demand for office space. We don't think that companies will be able to capture all of that in terms of reducing their amount of leased space, because people will want to come. They'll all want to be in the office. It's all about meeting. It's all about the business trip, as Richard explained. It's all about interactions, teamwork. People will all have to be there at the same time. So you can't even that out. You've got peak loading. We think there's an efficiency factor that will cut back that drop in demand, number of days worked in the office into actual space required. The companies at best will be able to capture maybe 55% of that. But then I think also around this kind of reimagining of the office, the creation of amenity, the creation of space to collaborate for teamwork. With teams the nature of work is changing, and teams are everything within companies. They're responsible for organizing work within companies and outside of work. So everything revolves around the team. I think that's going to require some dedensification. Offices have seen a huge densification, just a constant lowering of space per worker over the last 20 years. We see some of that, reversing. In fact, quite a lot of that reversing. So I think this kind of 32% drop in days in the office actually amounts to only 9% drop in demand for space. But, this is, it is still nevertheless an economic hit to the downtown area, less revenue going into the assets of the downtown area. That's that is something that, could trigger less investment. And that's what we have to watch out for. We think there's normally a pretty, if you look at the North American situation, a pretty close relationship between vacancy and rental growth. And you can see that these things oscillate in inverted relationship with one another over time. We've had a really long boom in kind of office employment growth in the United States. Strangely enough, a huge growth in office using employment over the last 10 years. With that long growth in vacancy, a long trend up in rental values, making core areas quite expensive. But we do think that kind of with both the economic hit from the COVID, but more particularly the acceleration of remote working, we do see quite a long period of rents being stagnant and vacancy being elevated. We just have to watch that. We have to handle it because it is a hit to the downtown area. And one thing I would just caution against, the scale of the economic boom that is coming is really huge. And I don't know whether it's going to last a decade, but it's going to last a couple of years at the very least. And I think we just need to be careful that we don't lose sight of these long-term trends, in the general prosperity that's coming just because governments are spending a lot of money. That will be a pulse. It won't necessarily be a 10-year trend, in my view. Just looking at the other part of this that kind of concerns me, and other speakers will have referred to this. I'm just looking here at rent growth in the industrial and logistics sector. This is a sector that normally follows the economy like every other real estate sector. You get employment falling, you get rents falling. But what's really amazed us in the real estate community, or perhaps shouldn't have done really, but Q4 2020, we've had the biggest hit to the economy in 100 years, but we have record net absorption of industrial space. Something like 300 million square feet in the Americas. And it's just really, the acceleration of internet penetration of retail, and just no impact on rents whatsoever, no impact on absorption. And of course, this isn't a specific downtown impact. It's kind of goods being distributed. It's a hit to all retail. But I think the fact is that goods are being distributed from these big centres in the suburbs. Again, it takes income out of the downtown area that otherwise would have been there. Actually, my point is it takes income out of all retail assets, but quite a lot of those are in downtown areas. So this hits the big malls. For the first time ever, I think I've heard that, the big power malls in the United States, which have been just kind of money generating machines over the last 20 or 30 years, they are seeing rises in vacancy as well. And it's interesting to me that the mall is probably the most successful business model of the 20th century, that it's finally being kind of threatened by this. But the mall itself is just a recreation of a kind of idealized downtown. And, you know, there is some negatives for the downtown area coming out of this. You know, and my point is that retail is going online. We know that it's surged. You know, there is a thought that it might drop off again. I do actually see, under the boom conditions that are coming, some sort of surprising revival in physical retail, particularly as food and beverage reinvents itself. But I don't think we should be blind to the longer term from the kind of stimulus-led growth that we're about to see. Physical retail, you know, same sort of analysis. We've had this surge in retail sales as everybody has sat at home and bought stuff online. But nevertheless, you know, retail rents are heading downwards. And again, that could, you know, the potential there for underinvestment hitting downtown areas probably quite high. As I say, all sectors of physical retail have been affected, downtown and suburban. But, you know, we're focused, you know, along with the hit to the office sector, then I think we know we need to be just a little bit careful about what's going on in downtown areas. You know, a lot of the, just again on this area of retail, it's been a record year for retail bankruptcies. Now, all of these companies will come back, but they'll come back more hybrid, they'll come back more online, and that there will be a shrinkage in the amount of retail space that is required. Hotels are much less, you know, hotels have been really hard hit. You know, we've seen that. One of the areas we've got debt delinquency, we've got, you know, actual hotels being sold, big famous hotels, you know, ceasing to exist. You know, anything that's, anything in the hotel sector that is catered for domestic leisure has done well, but these luxury and upper scale hotels, upscale, upper mid-scale, these are downtown full service hotels, you know, they are still struggling. You know, frankly, I think this is probably, the recovery story is 2 to 3 years in the hotel sector. But you know, I think, you know, the hotel sector is one of the ones I'm least worried about. I mean, the appetite for leisure and culture and travel, you know, it will almost certainly come back. But it will take some time, and, you know, to the extent that these big full-service hotels are located in the downtown area, you know, although it's not a long-term issue, I think it is a near-term threat to the downtown area. Just how much these upper-end hotels, you know, are being hit and suffering from underinvestment. Just on apartments, what are we seeing? You know, apartments across the Western world, particularly in North America, you know, extremely strong cycle. Last 10 years, you know, associated, I think, with a lot of factors: demographics, lack of access to mortgages. You know, just very strongly out of the traps after the great financial crisis, but hit hard by the by COVID-19. Well, I say hit hard. The actual, because governments have intervened in the housing market, we haven't seen vacancy rising too much. But what I want to point to is where we have seen vacancy rising, it's been in the big urban cores. It seems to be not, you know, the idea of urban flight, as Richard spoke to, I think is fanciful. There's no real evidence that people are leaving cities. But what has happened is there is a wave of new renters that haven't come into the cities. That, you know, why pay a full rent when all the urban amenities are closed? So I think this will pick up. This isn't something that particularly worries me as a long-term trend. Much more worried about the decentralization of retail and the decentralization of work as long-term trends. So just to finish off, you know, I do believe centripetal forces are on the increase. You know, service sector jobs are dispersing. You know, families want more space. partly as an after effect of the pandemic, but they specifically want more affordability. And if they can get, you know, a place of their own and still have a job that is kind of urban in nature, then, you know, you're going to see, you know, some dispersal of activity. I think retail, you know, you know, growth in online retail, I think is set to continue. Particularly, it's penetrating the grocery sector. And I think that takes income out of central areas. And of course, transport costs are falling because people don't need to commute as much. So centrifugal forces are increasing. I think, you know, we need to address this from a policy perspective fairly quickly. We need to focus on mass transit, get people back on mass transit. There's going to be an after effect there. We maybe even need temporary cuts to property taxes. We need to focus on arts, you know, events, festivals, leisure, art, sport, anything that boosts income in the downtown area. And, you know, as people have said, more focus on live and play, perhaps less on work. Let's get more affordable housing downtown. You know, I don't think, as I say, this is an existential issue for downtown areas. They're extremely resilient, but just remember that period from 1950 to, you know, kind of 1990, these long waves in the city, you know, if they get out of control and you get a cycle of underinvestment creeping in, you know, they can get out of control and they can blight areas for longer than we would really want. So we need to address this with policy. You know, just like all of us need a COVID-19 shot in the arm, I think downtowns probably need some sort of digital vaccine that comes from policy. So thank you for listening. I hope that was interesting.
I like the digital vaccine idea, Richard. That's great. If I can ask Richard and Craig to come back, and we have a bit of time. We are on a sharp deadline because we're trying to get many voices in, as we say. So we have to finish sharp on the 45 minutes. I will watch for that. Lots of comments, lots of enthusiasm and appreciation for the three of you taking the time. And I just want to say, just a reminder, who said economists are boring? Come on, you've just had 75 minutes with the three really interesting economists. So thanks, guys. Question, let's start with this, based on what people are putting into the chat. Can we imagine that CBDs and downtowns will become, will they come back in a way that is more inclusive?
Not without policy. And I think Richard said that. I think that without policy, they come back in a way that's much more exclusive. And look, property is expensive. Like, these are the most expensive areas of cities. So there is no way they can come back. And I think, and just one thing in addition to what Richard said, there's a very good paper circulating by a downtown expert called The Rise of Downtown Disorder. And in this vacuum, we have seen our downtowns experience a wave of, I wouldn't say not necessarily violent crime, property crime, and just disarray, that I would add to the policy mix of them having to come back. That if they remain this disorderly, if they remain fearful, that which has happened, less so in the Canadian, I want to say this, much more so in the US context and the Canadian context. I think that's another area that policy has to address, that when people get scared, they get afraid. But no, without policy, they're going to be not as inclusive as we nearly like.
Yeah, if I could just chip in there as well. I mean, before I was with CBRE, I was with Grosvenor, the big London landed estate with 300 acres of Mayfair and Belgravia. It's a little known fact. I mean, that is some of the primest real estate in the world. It's a little known fact that 30% of the housing units on that estate were affordable. So, you know, I think most cities will need around 25%, big high performing cities will need about 25% of their stock as affordable. But I'm not talking about old fashioned, what we in the UK call council housing. Yeah. You can be really creative about this, and you can have a mixture of tenure types. You can have people who can move through and shared ownership schemes. But this is really, I think, one of the areas in which policy can really intervene is in terms, and it's bankable. You know, in an era when bond rates are like, zero, big institutions will invest in this. It's patient long-term capital can be found if governments can get the right legal framework for this to take place.
Richard, do you think housing is the key thing? Richard Barkham, would you encourage and create policies to incentivize conversions of office buildings that may not need to have all their space taken up by commercial uses?
Well, I mean, I think there's a technical challenge there with large floor space.
Floor plate.
You know, it's not easy to do that conversion. I mean, where it can be, yes, I do think so. I think, you know, one of the secrets of success for cities is just flexibility within the built environment. You know, again, the kind of, you know, Grosvenor Estate example, the Georgian house, you know, was a single family home, you know, became an office, it's gone back to a single family home. To the extent that we can get flexibility within the built environment, particularly around housing, I would agree.
So zoning, obviously, lots of implications. We've got lots of people in the chat that know zoning. Craig Alexander, do you think that there's a choice to be made about investing in downtown cores and not in the periphery, or is there some way to enable a kind of healthier decentralization? Do you think that might happen? Craig first, and then whoever wants to jump in.
Like most things in life, you know, balance is a preferred approach. Right. So, you know, yes, there's been a shift in, you know, with the acceleration in digital and the more flexible remote workplace, you know, you've got a shift in preferences towards, okay, now maybe I want to live in the suburbs because now I actually can, or I want to live farther out of the city because my employer said that I don't have to come back into the office when the pandemic is over. But at the same time, you know, so you're going to need to make investments to support those individuals, right? Like you know, expanding the digital infrastructure is a great example. And then there's but we still have to invest in our urban centers. And just to pick up on that last theme that you were talking about, you know, when I talked about, if we go back and we look at other business cycles and we said, okay, so what does a recovery look like? Right, we would be talking about, okay, so what are stimulus measures that will accelerate economic growth and recover the jobs that were lost? And in this case, we're actually talking more about like not just GDP, right? What we're actually talking about, you know, not just GDP and jobs, like number of jobs, right? What we're now talking about is more inclusive recovery that includes, you know, good quality jobs, and also changing the outcomes across the income distribution. And this is why actually the notion that, like, you know, thinking about housing affordability issues is actually part of your economic recovery, you know, strategy, which I don't think has ever been true in past recessions. Like, I don't think that if we look back in 2008 or we look back in the early 90s, I don't think we would have been talking about affordable housing as part of a recovery strategy.
Yeah. So we're counting the wrong things. I mean, there were lots of comments in the chat about this. Is it really only about economic growth? Richard Florida, you've kind of... You
better have economic growth because you're not going to do a lot of things if you don't. And I think we as urbanists have gotten to a very unproductive argument about, do we need to limit economic growth in favor of equity? We need economic growth and equity. And the key to economic growth in any advanced society is urban concentration. That's what we know from Jane Jacobs to Robert Lucas to Ed Glazer. That's where innovation comes from. But we can do it in a more equitable way, both on the supply side by providing more affordable housing. Richard nailed that. If we're going to convert commercial to residential, highest and best use, residential has a higher price point. We better include some measures to create affordability. In New York, you know, you build new, you get density, you build 25 to 30% affordable. Richard also mentioned these new tools, impact funds. I'm part of a major impact fund now in Toronto, where we're going to build our fund based on realizing the UN Sustainable Development Goals for inclusive, safe, resilient, and affordable cities. So there's a wash of capital that can come to this with the right kind of governance around it, and we can build more. It's not going to be the old way. But on the demand side, nearly half of our jobs are shitty, low-wage service jobs done by essential workers. We've got to raise those incomes, and we've got to figure out a way collectively to do what we did for manufacturing jobs, you know, 75 years ago, to make those jobs higher paying, more productive, engaging, better jobs with internal career paths. If we fail to do that, where there's going to be hell to pay, you can already see the political consequences of that in our elections. But I think there's an opportunity. There's a once in a century opportunity to do it now.
both of you, sorry, all three of you, all of you have made the point about retail being a completely transformed, disrupted through this and the ramping up of online. And we, CUI has been doing a lot on bringing back Main Street, and we see the Restore the Core conversation is kind of the other side of that coin, because of course every downtown CBD has main streets too. But do you think that consumers can contribute in a positive way to this? If all those street retail jobs are gone off of downtown streets, where are those people going to work?
So
where are those jobs going to be?
Let me say one thing about this, Mary, and
Sure.
very quickly. The biggest negative consequence of all of this is on the service workers in central business districts. The research is clear on this. It's not you and I and Richard and Craig who can work remotely. It's the people who service those buildings that get a whack that's unbelievable.
So I don't know where are those jobs going to surface?
But that's the challenge, right? That's what I was trying to stress around the fact that what has happened is we have had an acceleration of the IT revolution, and we were always worried about what was going to happen, or we were always cognizant of the fact that a lot of sort of middle skill positions were in declining demand, and that digital skill requirement was going to go up. And we, there was a lot of, thinking around like what will the IT revolution do to labor markets? And what I was trying to stress was that the pandemic has actually accelerated the impact of that digital transformation. And so when we look at the job numbers, you see a lot of cyclicality. Like you see, when the lockdown ended in May, we had a huge rebound in employment. So what you didn't see underneath the surface was that the actual demand for skills had changed.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's because you can't see it because of everything else that's going on. And I think that's where we need to be mindful in terms of like from a labor market recovery point of view. There are going to be deep labor market scars created by this environment. And Richard was absolutely focused on the right people. It's like there's a lot of service industry people that can't go back to the job that they had before, and they don't have the skills they need for success down the road. And so that's one of the big legacies we've got to overcome.
And you had the answer in your previous job, Mary. Upgrade those jobs in a basic universal income. You had the answer. The answer was there, and we were working on it. We need a basic universal income. We've seen what the stimulus can do and how good it is for the economy. It's not just for the people. It is for the people, but it's good for the economy. It's good for savings and better jobs. We were working on it before that got derailed. So we kind of know what to do. It's just been politically a challenge.
I don't think we're going to end up with a universal income program, but I do think we are going to end up with a better income support framework.
I agree.
That's just my 2 cents.
Go ahead, Richard Barkham.
Yeah, no, I would say just to be careful as urbanists, we can't solve every problem. Some of this is about national tax and spend, and there is just maybe a lot of this inequality has come through globalization. It's come through sort of technology, but some of it is just the kind of Thatcher Reagan kind of tax cuts that took place in the early 80s. If we're moving a little bit, towards a more balanced, sort of taxation system, that's not something individual cities can do, but it's a national priority that has to tackle that.
Well, Richard, we at the Canadian Urban Institute like to think that the drivers of the economy and the drivers of social innovation are actually local municipal governments and local city ecosystems, of which all of you participate. So we don't underestimate the power of actually affecting national tax policy and provincial tax policy by advocating from the order of government that's closest to the people. Just saying. So, but I hear you that it's these are larger issues. And I just want to take a moment to thank you guys for coming on and getting us off to a really, really important start. You can see the chat is kind of blown up with lots of people going in about a whole bunch of things. Everything's going to get posted. The fact that that we got 3 distillations of these folks that are spending their days thinking about this to get us into the path of what is the future for downtown. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us and to plug the fact that in 15 minutes we're going around the world to Greg Clark in London, to Abba in Washington, D.C., who works for the World Bank globally, with Gabrielle Charlotte, who's from Mexico City, but is in Amsterdam, and with Alicia, who is with Spur in San Francisco. So a really important session about how we're part of something much bigger than just the cities that we happen to all live in. So thanks very much, guys. Really great to have you. Richard, and Craig, I really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mary.
Thanks so much.